Hey everyone, this is going to be a really short video because everything I go over here I'm going to go over in more detail tomorrow. But I wanted to give you something of a heads up for what it takes to create interactive sketches. So far the sketches we've been creating are basically static. They might as well be stuff printed on a piece of paper because they're immovable by user input or other types of dynamic changes to the programming environment. So for example, if we take a look at what I have here in this sketch, I've got 4 lines of code that generate an ellipse within a display window that is 500 by 500 pixels in width and height with a white background, 255 as the background shade. The ellipse is a dark gray of 100 in value, and the ellipse itself is at the center of the screen. Width divided by 2 is obviously 250, and then height divided by 2 is also 250. And since an ellipse by default is centered by its center point, that's why it's there. And then 100 by 100, that's the width and height of the ellipse itself. But the point here is that I can't move it with my mouse, with the keyboard, or in any other way. It's a static object inside the display window. Well, it's time to start using processing and really a programming language generally for what it's so good at doing, which is interactive types of effects. So let me close out this display window. I'm going to delete all this code, and let me type in a few things that represent just the very basics of what you're going to have to do for every single sketch moving forward in order to incorporate some aspect of interactivity. These two methods or functions right here, setup and draw, are the basis for interactivity. Every sketch you write moving forward is going to have these two methods in it. Now ultimately it's really this method here that is the basis for interactivity, but typically these two are paired together. So what is draw and what is setup? Draw method is a method built into the processing language, so processing recognizes it for what it's supposed to do. It is a function that will run any code inside the opening and closing curly braces over and over and over again for as long as the display window is open, which means for as long as the sketch is running. Typically it runs at about 60 frames per second. Setup, on the other hand, runs any code inside the opening and closing braces once and only once at the very beginning of the sketch's run. So the moment the display window opens, the code and setup has basically already run, and then it jumps down to draw, and while the display window is open, runs the code that's in here over and over and over again. So in setup, you want to put methods and other types of code that you just want to run once at the beginning. So for example, the size method is a good one to put in here. So that's going to define the size of the display window, and that's not going to change. That's a good thing to put inside the setup. Now I could put the ellipse in setup too, but then I'd basically be recreating the static old kind of sketch that we've been doing in a sketch that's really finally designed for interactivity. So let's put the ellipse where we can start to play with it on an interactive level inside the draw. So first I'll put in the fill of 100. And then I'll put in width divided by 2, height divided by 2, 100 by 100, just so you can see it running. And this isn't going to look any different than the sketch that you had before. I still can't do anything really to it. I'll explain the use of background inside the draw tomorrow, but just to have it in there for now, the sketch really looks exactly like the one we had before. But now let's do some interesting stuff. Width divided by 2 and height divided by 2, which basically translates to 250, 250, is the center point of the screen, and that's why the ellipse was there. Well, what if I want the ellipse to move around? What if I want to be able to get user input via the mouse to move the ellipse around dynamically? Well, it turns out there are two built-in properties in processing, mouseX and mouseY. I believe you've been introduced to them, and they hold the values of the X and Y position of the mouse in real time throughout the running of your sketch. If I replace the fixed position of the ellipse with these two dynamically changing numbers, then all of a sudden we have an ellipse that moves around the screen. Okay, it follows the mouse. Now, you've been introduced to a method called print line, and I wanted to go ahead and type that into the draw 2, because print line is incredibly useful for you to understand what information is being used inside interactive parts of a sketch. So print line, all it does is print whatever is inside the parentheses to the message console, and that's obviously going to be the values of the X and Y position of the mouse. So I run this sketch again, and now you can see if I have the mouse pointer all the way to the very bottom, which would be 500 by 500, I'm getting pretty close to that. All the way at the top, which is 0, 0, I'm getting pretty close to that, and anything else in between. When you realize that you can start playing around with the code that you've already been working with by adding interactive or adding dynamic properties to it, you can really start having some fun. For example, I could create more than one ellipse, and each one of them could work with different values of mouseX and mouseY. For example, I could do mouseX times 0.5. And that's going to give me a different position for the X value. Obviously, it's going to be cut in half compared to Y, so that all of a sudden it's not really following the mouse. Also, I could put the ellipse directly in the middle of the screen, but I could use mouseX and mouseY to change the width and height of the ellipse. And I could also just do a combination of both. I could have mouseX and mouseY in the X, Y, and width and height positions of the ellipse. So there's nothing really amazing about this particular sketch, but what is amazing is that we're finally taking the step toward interactivity. Setup, but especially draw, is the basis for doing that, and I'll go over it in more detail tomorrow.